Everything thou thinkest thou knowest about history is probably wrong. And today we are going to prove it the hard way, by watching two people fall face first into every single myth history hath ever produced. Mara had a notebook full of facts and a habit of being right at the worst possible moments. Dex had confidence, a metal detector, and absolutely no filter between his brain and his mouth. They ran a tiny history channel out of a garage, and their new plan was simple: recreate famous historical moments using only what everybody knows about them, film the results, and see how badly things go. They started with the Vikings, because Dex owned a horned helmet he had bought at a Renaissance fair, and he was not going to let a global pandemic of misinformation stop him from wearing it on camera. He strapped it on, grabbed a wooden shield, and announced that he was ready to raid a village exactly like a real Viking warrior. Mara sighed and reminded him that Vikings never wore horned helmets in battle, but Dex was already posing dramatically for the thumbnail shot. The wrong assumption came from 19th century opera costumes, not from actual Norse warfare. An artist working on Wagner's Ring cycle decided horned helmets looked dramatic on stage, and the image stuck so hard that it became the default mental picture of a Viking for the next 150 years. Real Viking helmets that archaeologists have actually dug out of the ground are simple rounded caps, sometimes with a nose guard, because horns sticking out of your head are a fantastic way to get your skull yanked sideways by an enemy in close combat. The funny consequence arrived almost immediately. Dex tried to duck under a low doorway in the barn they were using as a set, forgot about the horns, and got the helmet wedged directly into the wooden frame. He hung there kicking, while Mara laughed so hard she dropped the camera. It took both of them and a bottle of cooking oil to get his head free, and the whole ordeal ended with a bruise on his forehead shaped suspiciously like a doorframe. Once he recovered, Mara explained that real Vikings were also traders, farmers, and explorers far more often than raiders, and that the horned helmet myth had completely overshadowed how advanced their shipbuilding and navigation actually were. Dex, rubbing his head, admitted defeat and switched to a plain leather cap for round 2. Temporary success achieved, dignity mostly intact. Their next target was Napoleon Bonaparte, because Dex had always heard he was ridiculously short, practically child-sized, and he wanted to reenact the emperor giving orders while standing on a stool for dramatic height. Mara tried to stop him before he even got the stool out of the garage, but Dex was already climbing onto it in a costume coat 2 sizes too big. The stage was set, and the adventure was about to begin. The problem was that Napoleon was actually about 5'6" or 7, which was completely average for a Frenchman of his era. The myth exploded because of a mix-up between French inches and English inches during translation, plus British propaganda cartoons that loved drawing him as tiny to mock his ego. His own guards, famously, were unusually tall, which made him look shorter standing next to them in portraits. Dex, standing proudly on his stool in an oversized coat, did not know any of this yet, and when Mara casually mentioned the real numbers, he lost his balance in surprise and toppled straight into a rack of costume swords. The clatter brought their neighbor running over to see if someone had been murdered in the garage, which made for an excellent bit of unplanned footage. After the neighbor left, satisfied that nobody was dying, Mara laid out the correction properly. Napoleon was of totally ordinary height. His nickname, Le Petit Caporal, was actually a term of endearment from his soldiers, not a comment on his stature. And the entire short Napoleon myth is basically a very old and very effective smear campaign that outlived the man himself by 2 centuries. Dex, extracting a sword from his sleeve, decided he needed a normal-sized chair instead of a stool for the rest of the shoot. With 2 myths down, they moved to something bigger. Literally, the claim that the Great Wall of China is visible from space with the naked eye. Dex loved this one because it sounded so impressive, and he wanted to build a scale model in the backyard to test whether they could see it from the roof of their two-story house, which he considered a reasonable stand-in for orbit. Mara pointed out that this comparison made no sense at all, but Dex was already up on the roof with binoculars, squinting at a strip of gray paint he had rolled across the fence line to represent the wall. From the roof, he could barely make it out. From actual space, astronauts have repeatedly confirmed that the wall is far too narrow, and its color blends too closely with the surrounding terrain to be seen without aid, even though claims about its visibility date back surprisingly far and got repeated in textbooks for generations. The funny consequence came when Dex, determined to get a better angle, climbed onto the chimney and lost his footing on a loose shingle. He slid halfway down the roof before catching himself on a gutter, dangling above the yard while still holding the binoculars in one hand, like he refused to let the mission fail, even in a near-death experience. Mara had to fetch the ladder while lecturing him the entire time about how visibility from orbit depends on width, contrast, and atmospheric conditions, none of which favor a structure that is at most about 30 feet wide in most sections. Once Dex was safely back on solid ground, slightly scraped and thoroughly humbled, Mara summarized the lesson. Many things humans consider massive achievements are still tiny compared to the scale of a planet. And the wall myth persists mainly because it is a satisfying story, not because it holds up to actual observation. Dex, brushing gravel off his jeans, admitted the roof experiment had at least proven one thing, that gravity is definitely still working correctly. Feeling slightly bruised from 2 rooftop-related injuries this week, the pair decided their next segment needed to happen entirely indoors. They picked Christopher Columbus, and specifically the widespread belief that people in his era thought the Earth was flat, and that his voyage proved otherwise. Dex prepared a whole speech about brave Columbus defying flat Earth doubters, and Mara let him get about halfway through it before interrupting. Educated Europeans in the late 15th century, she explained, had known the Earth was round for well over 1,000 years, going back to ancient Greek scholars who had even calculated its circumference with impressive accuracy using shadows and simple geometry. The actual disagreement Columbus faced from scholars was not about the shape of the planet, it was about the size of it. Experts correctly argued that the distance to Asia sailing west was far greater than Columbus believed, and if the Americas had not conveniently been in the way, his crew would likely have starved before reaching anything. The funny consequence here was less physical and more social. Dex had already recorded an entire dramatic monologue with a foam globe prop, arguing passionately against invisible flat Earth villains, and now had to admit on camera that his big emotional speech was aimed at a myth that mostly got popularized centuries later by a 19th century writer who wanted to paint the Catholic Church as anti-science. Watching him try to walk it back mid-recording, stammering and holding the foam globe like it had betrayed him personally, became one of the funniest clips of the whole shoot. Mara used the moment to explain how the flat Earth myth about Columbus spread through schools for generations, because it made a simple, satisfying story of ignorance versus discovery, even though the truth, a miscalculation about distance rather than shape, is honestly more interesting because it shows how being wrong about scale can accidentally lead to one of the most significant journeys in history. Dex, still holding his foam globe, conceded that reality was somehow both more embarrassing and more impressive than the myth. They needed a break from correcting themselves, so naturally they escalated straight into their most ambitious segment yet. A full costumed reenactment of Marie Antoinette supposedly saying, "Let them eat cake," when told the peasants had no bread. Dex, now fully committed to historical drama, insisted on delivering the line with an exaggerated French accent, while wearing a powdered wig that kept sliding over his eyes. Mara reminded him that there is no solid historical evidence Marie Antoinette ever said this at all. The phrase appears in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's writings years before she even arrived in France as a teenager, attributed to an unnamed great princess, and historians generally believe it got pinned on her later as anti-monarchy propaganda during the Revolution, when turning her into a symbol of aristocratic cruelty served a very specific political purpose. The wig kept sliding. Dex kept adjusting it mid-sentence, and on the fourth take, he tipped his head back to fix it, lost his balance on his heeled costume shoes, and sat down directly in a bowl of prop cake batter Mara had set up for a visual gag. The resulting photo, wig askew, frosting everywhere, became the thumbnail for the episode before either of them had even planned it. Once he peeled the frosting off, Mara delivered the educational core of the segment. Rumors and propaganda have shaped historical reputations far more than people realize. And Marie Antoinette's actual recorded behavior, including funding some charitable causes during famine years, gets almost entirely buried under one quote she likely never said. Dex, still finding frosting in his ear an hour later, agreed that reputations built on rumor can stick around a lot longer than the truth. By this point, their channel numbers were climbing, comments flooding in with more myths for them to test, and the stakes of the show quietly increased. Instead of one myth per segment, they decided to attempt a full medieval day challenge, living by common assumptions about the Middle Ages for 24 hours straight, filming the results as one continuous survival-style episode. The first assumption was that medieval people almost never bathed and were coated in filth their entire lives. Dex, taking this as permission, refused to shower for the whole day and loudly announced he was embracing authentic medieval hygiene. Mara let him enjoy his smugness for about 3 hours before correcting him, because medieval Europeans, especially in towns, actually valued bathing quite a bit, with public bathhouses common in many cities, and soap production was a real and fairly widespread industry. The consequence was immediate and social. Their downstairs neighbor knocked on the door within the hour to ask, with visible concern, whether something had died in the garage. Dex, mortified, sprinted for the shower mid-recording, and the footage of him abandoning the challenge less than a third of the way through became instantly popular with viewers who found his commitment to a myth, followed by his rapid and undignified surrender, extremely relatable. The first assumption was that medieval people almost never bathed and were coated in filth their entire lives. Dex, taking this as permission, refused to shower for the whole day and loudly announced he was embracing authentic medieval hygiene. Mara let him enjoy his smugness for about 3 hours before correcting him, because medieval Europeans, especially in towns, actually valued bathing quite a bit, with public bathhouses common in many cities, and soap production was a real and fairly widespread industry. The consequence was immediate and social. Their downstairs neighbor knocked on the door within the hour to ask, with visible concern, whether something had died in the garage. Dex, mortified, sprinted for the shower mid-recording, and the footage of him abandoning the challenge less than a third of the way through became instantly popular with viewers who found his commitment to a myth, followed by his rapid and undignified surrender, extremely relatable. Mara explained on camera that the myth of medieval filth largely comes from later periods, particularly parts of the Renaissance and early modern era, when some physicians actually believed bathing opened the pores to disease and discouraged it, alongside Victorian writers who liked painting the Middle Ages as a uniformly backward Dark Age to make their own era look more advanced by comparison. Dex, now clean and significantly more pleasant to be near, admitted this was one myth he was extremely happy to have been wrong about. Next in their medieval day challenge came the assumption that medieval people had painfully short lifespans, dying of old age by their late 20s or early 30s. Dex, trying to lean into character, began speaking to Mara as though she were ancient and near death, despite her being visibly younger than he was. Mara, unimpressed, explained that average lifespan statistics get dragged down enormously by extremely high infant and childhood mortality. Anyone who survived childhood in the medieval period had a very real chance of living into their 60s or 70s, and plenty of historical figures did exactly that. Dex, embarrassed again, tried to backpedal by claiming he had known that all along, which nobody believed, especially after the footage of him solemnly telling Mara she was living on borrowed time got replayed twice in the same segment for comedic effect. The lesson landed anyway, that averages can badly distort our sense of individual reality, a mistake that shows up constantly whenever people misread statistics rather than the full picture behind them. With the medieval day challenge wrapping up, danger, or at least the mild property damage kind of danger, started escalating. They decided to tackle the myth of Roman gladiators always fighting to the death, and Dex, fully invested in his role now, grabbed 2 foam swords and insisted the fight had to end in a dramatic death for authenticity, staging an elaborate battle across the entire backyard. Mara stopped him before he could stab a garden gnome for effect, explaining that most gladiator matches were not fights to the death at all. Gladiators were expensive to train and valuable as investments, and while fatalities did happen, event organizers generally preferred matches that ended with a clear winner and a defeated but living opponent, since dead gladiators could not fight again and represented lost revenue. Rules, referees, and even medical care for injured gladiators were part of the system, something closer to a high-stakes professional sport than random chaotic slaughter. Dex, disappointed that his dramatic backyard death scene needed rewriting, compromised by having his defeated foam sword opponent, played by a mop with a helmet taped to it, get spared instead of destroyed. The bit ended with him theatrically declaring mercy upon the mop, which the internet found unreasonably funny, and the clip ended up outperforming several of their more serious segments entirely. An unexpected setback hit right as they were planning their final big segment. Their camera's memory card corrupted overnight, wiping nearly a full day of footage from the gladiator and medieval hygiene segments. Mara, normally the calm one, actually panicked for a moment, since deadlines were approaching, and reshoots meant convincing their frosting-stained, sword-wielding, previously unwashed selves to redo everything. Dex, surprisingly, became the voice of reason for once, pointing out that they had learned enough from every previous myth to reshoot faster and sharper than the first attempt, since they now understood exactly which details mattered and which jokes actually landed. It was a rare and slightly unsettling role reversal, and Mara later admitted on camera that watching Dex be the responsible one for 5 minutes was almost more shocking than any historical myth they had debunked. For their final major challenge, they took on one of the biggest and most persistent myths of all, the idea that Albert Einstein failed math as a student. Dex, who had grown considerably more careful by this point, actually hesitated before commenting on it, which Mara found almost as funny as any of his earlier disasters. It turned out Einstein excelled at mathematics from a young age, mastering calculus in his early teens. The myth likely spread from a grading scale mix-up in Switzerland, where a 6 was the top grade in one system, and could easily be misread as low if someone assumed it followed the opposite scale used elsewhere. To wrap the episode with a proper demonstration, rather than another costume disaster, Dex attempted to solve a basic algebra problem on camera, to prove the Einstein myth wrong through his own experience with math, joking that if a genius supposedly struggled, surely he had an excuse for his own mediocre math grades. He got the problem wrong twice, live on camera, in front of an audience that had just learned Einstein was actually gifted at math from childhood. And Mara did not even need to say anything. She just stared at the camera, the way great comedic partners always do, while the moment spoke entirely for itself. With the corrupted footage reshot, the final myth debunked, and the backyard finally cleared of foam swords, frosting, and one very startled garden gnome, Mara and Dex sat down to record their wrap-up segment. They reviewed everything: the horned helmet stuck in a doorframe, the rooftop slide during the Great Wall experiment, the foam globe betrayal during the Columbus segment, the frosting incident, the one-day hygiene collapse, the mop that got spared from gladiatorial combat, and the algebra failure that accidentally proved its own point about Einstein. The through-line, Mara explained, was that history gets simplified into dramatic, tidy stories, because those stories are easier to remember and easier to repeat than the messier, more accurate truth. A horned helmet is more visually striking than a plain iron cap. A tiny emperor makes for a punchier insult than an average-sized one. A single cruel quote is easier to hate than a complicated woman caught in a revolution she did not fully control. Myths survive not because they are true, but because they are convenient, and convenience travels a lot faster than accuracy ever does. Dex, still finding the occasional streak of frosting on his equipment days later, added his own takeaway, that being confidently wrong on camera in front of thousands of people had at least taught him to actually check a fact before performing it dramatically in a rented costume, a lesson he suspected several historical propagandists could have used themselves. Mara agreed, noting that the same instinct that makes a myth spread, the appeal of a simple dramatic story, is exactly the instinct viewers should stay alert to whenever a fact sounds a little too perfectly convenient. They ended the episode the way they had started it, with Dex reaching for one more prop. This time a plastic Viking horned helmet he swore he was only keeping for irony. Mara didn't even look up from packing the camera gear before reminding him about the doorframe. Dex paused, glanced at the barn door, set the helmet down without a word, and the last shot of the episode was simply the two of them walking out of frame, Mara shaking her head, Dex still sneaking one last glance back at the helmet, like it might follow him home.